So, good morning, everyone. I would like to welcome you to day 3 of the ASBX and our third live panel session. And today we're talking about exploration class missions. And I think that that's something that we all find terribly exciting because it's really the vision of where humanity is going to be going in the future. And I'd like to begin by acknowledging the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation as the traditional custodians of the land upon which I live and work, and pay my respects to their elders, past and present, and to all First Nations people with us today. Just a little bit of housekeeping. If you're not speaking, I'd like to, the participants, ask you if you could please keep yourself muted and keep your camera off. But during question time, we'll see if we can make some opportunities for people to participate directly. However, please use the chat function as we go along for asking questions for the panelists for the Q&A session at the end. So basically how we're going to proceed is that I'm going to invite each panelist in turn, after I've introduced them, to share some information about what they're working on at present, and if they would like to do so, about their journey and what has brought them to an interest in space in particular. So I would like to begin by introducing Dr. Graziella Caprarelli, who is a wonderful advocate for space here in Australia, and also I'm really delighted to be able to count amongst my space friends. Graziella obtained her MSc in Geological Sciences and PhD in Earth Sciences from Sapienza University in Rome, Italy. She has had a long and respected career as an academic and scientist, teaching geoscience and planetary science in Europe, Japan, and Australia, and researching Earth and Mars geological processes. She currently holds honorary positions at the International Research School of Planetary Sciences in Italy, the Centre for Astrophysics at the University of Southern Queensland in Australia, and the International Space University in France. She was a NASA Fellow at the Johnson Space Center in Houston, subsequently joining the science teams of the high-resolution stereo camera and Mars experiments of the ESA mission Mars Express. In 2021, she was named Australian Space Scientist of the Year for her contribution to the discovery of liquid bodies of water on Mars. She is currently the president of the Women in Space chapter. So, Graziella, I invite you to take the floor. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Rowena, for that wonderful introduction. And of course, I count you among one of my dearest space friends in Australia. Basically, you have highlighted the main milestones of my career, and particularly my career in space. I work on Mars mostly these days. Basically, I have been bringing the knowledge of Earth processes to planetary bodies that are similar to Earth. And I started being interested in working on Mars, particularly during the Mars Global Surveyor mission, when I realized that the data that were returning from the satellite actually could be interpreted geologically if one used the knowledge of Earth processes to interpret what one was observing on the surface of Mars. So initially, I have been working mostly on volcanic processes until I became a member of the science team of the ground penetrating radar MARSIS, which has been looking for traces of liquid water and the distribution of ice from the subsurface of Mars since 2005. So the focus of my interest right now is, in terms of scientific interest, is the stability of ice on extraterrestrial bodies. And this is a very fascinating area of research, also because it ties in quite significantly with in situ resource exploration which relates to the presence of humans or human outposts on other planetary bodies, including the Moon and Mars. Because whilst humans may be interested in going to Mars for finding resources which may be precious on Earth, the reality is the most precious resource on an extraterrestrial body remains water, or the accessibility of ice that can then be used as water to extract oxygen and hydrogen for fuel as well. So I come to this forum from that particular perspective. As Rowena and everybody knows by now, I am not a medical doctor, so I am not an expert on the human body, but I certainly know that humans need water to survive anywhere. And so that is basically why I think I am interested in this particular forum as well.
Well, thank you very much for that wonderful introduction and insights to what you've been working on and what you will still be working on. And I think it's a very great background to bring to this type of panel, because of course we need a team to be able to send humans to the Moon or to the Mars or anywhere else. I would next like to introduce with great pleasure Dr. Brett Gooden. Dr. Gooden has a lifelong interest in human rocket flight. He obtained his MBBS and MD degrees from the University of Adelaide and a PhD from the University of Nottingham. In 1961, he joined the British Interplanetary Science Society and was elected a Fellow of the Society in 1973. In 1963, his first astronautical paper was published in Spaceflight, entitled Physiological Responses of Man in Orbit, in which he reviewed the earliest medical results from human space flights. He lectures and researches in the area of human aerospace physiology. Brett has written a number of books, including Diving and Asphyxia, Spacesuit, and recently Matter, Manned Missile of the Third Reich, and Historic Step to Human Spaceflight. He currently lectures in space medicine and physiology for the International Space University at the University of South Australia. Brett, I invite you to take the floor. Thank you.
Thank you, Rowena. Good morning, everybody. It's a pleasure to join you all on this panel. And I'd like to thank Joshua and Rowena very much for inviting me to be part of this conference. My interest in space medicine and space physiology began 60 years ago when I was a fledgling medical student at the University of Adelaide. In 1963, in my third undergraduate year, I wrote a review paper for the British Interplanetary Society's new journal called Spaceflight, and I boldly entitled it The Physiological Responses of Man in Orbit. In this article, I reviewed and discussed the meagre findings of the effects of weightlessness on the human body at that time, including the cardiovascular system. In particular, I focused on the persistent fall in blood pressure that occurred in astronauts when they stood up after spaceflight, a phenomenon that we know as orthostatic hypotension or orthostatic intolerance. This fall in blood pressure can result in near fainting and, in the worst case scenario, total loss of consciousness. And so my research over the years has involved cardiovascular physiology in humans and a number of other animals, and it's focused on the reflex responses of heart and peripheral circulation. So now to the Mars mission. So a Mars mission could subject astronauts to a gravity field less than Earth for a total of almost 3 years, a prodigious length of time. What adaptive changes will occur in the cardiovascular system of astronauts during such a prolonged exposure to hypogravity? And what is the risk of them losing consciousness when exposed to acute head-to-foot accelerations, for example, during the landings and takeoffs involved in such a mission? How will their circulation respond when they eventually return to Earth after this mission and enter Earth's gravitational field? Will the astronauts return as circulatory cripples? What rehabilitation might be required to help to restore their circulatory function to normal? These are all mission critical questions, and presently we cannot answer any of them with any degree of certainty. So before we send astronauts on a mission to Mars, much carefully crafted research will need to be done on the effects of prolonged hypogravity on the human body, and in particular on the circulatory system. So it's back to you, Rowena. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Brett, for that wonderful introduction and for raising all those really interesting questions which we need to think about as we try to go forward, especially to Mars. And hopefully we can talk a little bit more about those as we go through our session today. Next special guest I would like to introduce is Dr. Tim Squire. Dr. Squire is a radiation oncologist working at the Townsville Cancer Centre in Australia, where he's part of the MR Linear Accelerator team treating cancer patients with advanced technology. And he is also a senior lecturer at James Cook University. Dr. Squire is a member of the Australasian Society of Aerospace Medicine and was recently appointed as a member for the Technical Advisory Group for Radiation Countermeasures at the Australian Space Agency. He has an interest in radiation protection in space, circadian rhythm, and bioastronautics. He has published research and received funding for research in the field of novel radiation shielding materials. Dr. Squire has been an invited speaker to international conferences, including the NASA Langley Research Facility in Virginia, USA. So Tim, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Rowena, for that introduction and inviting me to be on this panel today. It's been nice working with you and Josh at the advisory group for the agency recently, and my sort of avenue to this field is a bit circuitous. I'm a radiation oncologist by trade, as you mentioned, and I'm currently at work and on call, so I might need to drop out for some phone calls. But my research began looking at tumour responses to radiation treatment and whether there were differentials between whether they were irradiated in the day or the night. And it got me thinking about astronauts in space and not really having much day or night. So it was a bit of a tangent to that. But our research group kind of approaches the radiation protection problem looking at sort of radio protection strategies that we use here on Earth and what we use at work to decrease our radiation exposure in terms of decreasing time, increasing distance, and shielding, which largely we've kind of transferred over to the space sector. So we've been looking at novel materials for shielding, such as graphene and other nanomaterials. In terms of decreasing exposure time, we've had a look at electrical propulsion versus chemical propulsion. Some other novel things we've been looking at is biological shielding in terms of the role that circadian rhythm might play in terms of future deep space missions and even astronaut torpor, and perhaps how that may limit radiation damage. And finally, we've been very lucky to have the first MR linear accelerator in Australia installed here, and we've been doing some provisional research in terms of magnetic shielding as well, so active shielding for future space missions. So a bit of a different slant. I'm not a scientist, but a clinician, but there's potentially some overlap from therapeutic radiotherapy to what may happen with radiation exposure to astronauts in the future, and potentially some transition between those two fields. Thanks very much.
Thank you. That was a really fascinating insight to the sort of leading edge or cutting edge of science that you're working on at the moment. And I think it also highlights the real importance in the space area of the back and forth translational aspect of the work that we're doing and that we can do. So thank you very much for that. And now I would like to introduce our final panelist today, who is a dear space friend of mine as well from the Mars Society Australia, Dr. Jonathan Clark. Jonathan has had a lifelong interest in space exploration and planetary science. In 2001, he joined Mars Society Australia, becoming president in 2012, a position he has held to the present. John has taken part in 6 Mars analogue expeditions in Australia and 1 each to Ladakh in India and New Zealand. He's also participated in 3 rotations at the Mars Desert Research Station in Utah, 1 of 2 weeks and 1 of 4 weeks duration, and in the Mars 160 expedition, which spanned 3 months at MDRS and 1 month at Devon Island at the Flashline Arctic Research Station in the Canadian Arctic. Jonathan has been an associate of the Australian Centre for Astrobiology since 2004, an online instructor in astrobiology at Swinburne University, and an adjunct faculty member at the Amity Centre of Excellence in Astrobiology in India. He currently works on Mars in EVA suits for human aerospace. So John, the floor is yours. Oh, can't hear you, John, sorry.
Even I don't want to listen to me. Yeah, I'll say up front, I'm an imposter. I'm a geologist. I'm not in any shape or form a medical person. So my main interest here is the role of space medicine in enabling expeditions to the moon, to Mars, long-term research facilities on these bodies, and perhaps beyond. And of course, this includes the journeys to and from. And so my focus is practical. It's on the good, what is good enough. It doesn't have to be perfect, and it needs to also. I feel quite strongly, because of my analog research background, that we should take as much advantage as possible of analogs of people living in extreme environments on Earth. At high altitude, for example, when we're talking about exploration atmospheres, about people living in naturally high radiation environments. So, for example, Ramsar in Iran, Guarapi Beach in Brazil, and also, of course, using International Space Station, and before that, Mir, and other space station missions before that. Back to you.
Great, thank you very much. Well, we have 4 fantastic, really interesting panelists with us today. So now I'm going to go to our teaser questions. And the first one is, can we adequately prepare humans, both physiologically and psychologically, for the rigors of living off-world in a new hostile environment? So I might throw that open to the panel. Please, please feel free to speak up. It often works better if we don't sort of go in turns, but we'll see how we go.
Sorry, wrong button. Clearly I am not the person to answer the question, but just out of my own, idea, I don't think we can adequately prepare anyone for anything these days. Certainly not for space, but certainly we can be as prepared as we can. I think John mentioned earlier, I mean, you don't want the perfect to be the enemy of the good. And I kind of agree to that. I think we will not know really what what it takes until we actually put humans on these long-term deep space missions. Certainly, though, we can do as much research as we can on the physical conditions of those environments, which is where the geoscientists / astrophysicists come in, so that we know as much as possible, and we can then prepare for those kind of situations that we know exist, that are based on the physical environment. Then how the human body obviously reacts, particularly long-term to long-term stressors, that's obviously a question for medical doctors that work with human bodies. But I think that, you know, we have to perhaps be looking more to a psychological profile of human that is prepared to be unprepared, that accepts that perhaps there is quite a lot of unknown there and feels confidence on how to react to the unknown, rather than having the confidence of knowing everything that they can find out there. So that's my profane, you know, as a person who doesn't know anything about human physiology or human psychology, that would be my take for that.
I would agree with those comments, Graziella. I think, I mean, particularly in the radiation front, there's a large degree of uncertainty, particularly with modelling and the types of radiation that we have data on from a clinical point of view. Our secondary malignancy risk following radiotherapy is based on A-bomb survivors, which is obviously a huge different type of radiation that's received to the whole body with different dose rates, etc. So there will have to be a certain amount of uncertainty that will be accepted, because we can't ethically irradiate humans and see if they develop cancers or heart disease and that sort of thing. So it'll require a combination of more accurate modelling, but acceptance of uncertainty.
Can I make a comment, Rowena?
Yes, please.
Firstly, I think the psychological factors are going to be extremely important, because I suspect that the crew will be limited in number. And to have these people engage in activity together for upwards of 2-3 years without returning to Earth and being dependent upon each other will put them under enormous psychological stress. No matter how you put it, this is a tremendous ask of any group of people. And I agree that the psychological research and psychological investigation is extremely important. As far as the physiology goes, I would hope that we can study astronauts who spend time in weightlessness and then go onto the lunar surface at 1/5 G and spend time on the lunar surface in a base there, and then transit again up to weightlessness and then finally back to Earth. And in that way, we'll begin to understand the dynamics as far as the physiology goes, and my interest is the cardiovascular, as far as that goes, in relation to a Mars mission, because in a Mars mission, we have transit from 1 G to weightlessness, then 1/3 G, then weightlessness, and then back to 1 G. And we really have absolutely no idea at the moment of what that will do to the physiology.
Yeah, my own take on this is it's all about quantifying uncertainty and quantifying risk as opposed to hazards. I mean, there are many hazards that all of us face every day, and we have some idea of the actual level of risk that's involved, and on the basis of that, we decide whether or not we're going to do them. And this is true whether we're going to be bungee jumping or climbing mountains, going to the Antarctic or crossing the road or having a COVID injection. Really what we need to say is what level of risk are we prepared to accept to send people to the moon for a 6-month rotation, to Mars for a 2.5-year round trip. And if the level of risk as opposed to the level of hazard is unacceptable, what we can do to bring that down. And that means also accepting a level of uncertainty. I must say I'm much more optimistic about the psychological factors. The amount of, if you look at the historic polar expeditions, for example, Otto Sverdrup's expedition to the Canadian Arctic, or the so-called heroic age of polar expeditions, people lived under much tougher conditions than any Martian crew is likely to experience, which will be in a climate-controlled environment, good food, good lighting, and much more carefully selected people. But yes, we'll need to look at the psychological factors. And my own experience in much shorter expeditions is a well-chosen crew is an enormous asset. I'll do it again with the people I've spent time in the Arctic with.
Yes, I think you've all highlighted some of the really important issues, those transition between gravity fields, and a lot of those are known unknowns at the moment, and the whole need for our expeditioners to be people who can be very psychologically resilient and flexible and able to work cohesively as a team, because I sometimes joke about sending 6 people to Mars, and when you get there, there's only 1 person left because everyone else has been pushed out the airlock. So we want to make sure that that doesn't happen. And so crew selection is going to be also an enormous part of this, I feel, as we go forward. So
can I add just one thing to that? Because I think it is obviously the first step, as Brett mentioned, to send a human avant-post to live long-term on the moon in preparation for deeper space travel and longer space travel. But going back to the psychological aspect, I think that if I am to go to the moon and I am going to spend a long time there, I know that if I want, within 3 days or 9 hours, depending on the rocket I'm using, I can be back on Earth and solve whatever problem I have. I don't have that option if I go to Mars. So psychologically speaking, the demands of a Mars mission for humans are going to be slightly different, I would imagine, than those for the moon. So using the moon as a stepping stone to Mars, maybe working technologically might work, but I don't know that we are going to prepare humans for a trip to Mars simply by looking at moon conditions. Not that anyone is advocating that, but certainly that needs to be, in my opinion, that should be factored in. From Mars, you don't come back as easily anyway. So part of your mental preparation has to be really that you're going to be all alone out there, often without reach even of radio communication with Earth. What are you going to do next? That's the next big question.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good point, because once you start the engines for Mars, there's no turning back. And so it is a completely different set of circumstances. It's really substantially going into the unknown. And John, you mentioned earlier about the polar explorers who were essentially doing a quite similar thing, being very isolated for months at a time with no hope of rescue. And do you see any parallels that we can draw from that expeditionary history and the lessons from that for the situation of going to Mars?
Well, I certainly do. And I also agree very much with Graziella. The moon's a fantastic place. I'm all for going back to the moon. But I think the value of going back to the moon as a pathfinder for going to Mars is often exaggerated. A lot of the technology is actually going to be quite different. Spacesuits, for example, you cannot wear a lunar suit on Mars. It's just going to be too heavy. And there are going to be systems on there which won't work. They'll work fine on the moon, but they won't work on Mars. There'll be things that they have that are certainly not needed for a Mars EVA suit. Also, There's the isolation factor. It's a much longer, much more demanding mission in that regard. But also the other thing about going back to the moon will help operationally. What sort of tempo should people do? How frequently can people go on EVA? Because we're not going to go to the moon or Mars and we just skulk inside a hab for 6 months or 2 years or whatever. We're going there to go outside as often as we can, to do as much as we can. And that's very different to the International Space Station or any previous space station. So operationally, it's going to be very useful. Experience of biomedical factors in a different gravity field, that's going to be useful to some extent, even though it's a different field. Technologically, a little bit, but mainly operationally. Speaking as a geologist.
Would anyone else like to comment before we move on to the next teaser question?
I'd just like to make a point, and I make this point in my recorded presentation, of the problem that could be faced by the astronauts when they land on Mars after 9 months transit time with regard to this problem of orthostatic hypotension. We do have methods of reducing this problem. We could use elastic stockings, and graded pressure hosiery has been tried and has been reasonably successful in controlling any drop in pressure in astronauts during landing. But I am concerned about the situation where a Mars spacecraft is entering the Martian atmosphere, and then there is a problem with control of the angle of the spacecraft, and that may result in G vectors or acceleration forces on the astronauts which are not normally planned for, and what significance that might have. The other time where I think the astronauts could be at risk with regard to orthostatic hypertension is the takeoff from Mars. We have to realize that the astronauts have now been in a hypogravity state for a considerable length of time, maybe up to almost 2 years. And one wonders what would happen again during the launch phase from Mars to the cardiovascular system. Again, if there's some unusual problem with spacecraft control and attitude of the spacecraft. And although the gravity on Mars, of course, is only a third approximately of that of Earth, we have to remember that these astronauts may now be acclimated to 1/3 G if they've been on Mars for a year or more. And so they will respond in a way that will be different from an astronaut being launched from Earth, of course. And the last thing is, of course, the re-entry to Earth's atmosphere after possibly up to almost 3 years at hypogravity. Again, some problem with attitude to the spacecraft might be a threat to astronauts losing consciousness. Now, of course, with autopilots, that may not be a concern, but if the spacecraft is out of some sort of control, then the astronauts may, at that moment, need to have critical input to salvage the re-entry phase. So there are all these factors, these times, these critical times in a Martian mission where the astronauts' cardiovascular status, for example, is of considerable importance for the success of the mission.
Those are all really excellent points, and also great unknowns, which, as you say, could potentially be very challenging. So I think we might go on to our second teaser question, which is, why do we need to think about different spacesuits for EVAs in space, on the moon and on Mars? So I will throw that open to the panel for comment, but maybe John, you might like to start off.
Yes, we always just tend to think of, oh, you know, the moon is space, Earth orbit is space, Mars is space, but they're actually quite different environments. So there is less difference between the moon and Earth orbit, obviously. They're both vacuum. They both have a space debris risk, which means you need a protective outer layer. They both, because they're vacuum, sublimation cooling will work on both places. On the moon, you can't have your suit being too heavy. So a suit of mass of no more than 100 kilograms is what you need. Lighter is always better. In Earth orbit, mass is not so critical. In fact, it can be an advantage because it's easier to secure a heavy EVA suit from drifting around than a lighter one. But there is, of course, issues of trying to move a massive suit. Inertia doesn't disappear, so that can cause muscular strains. But it's not so critical as on the moon. On Mars, if you want your people to work sustainably, the work from various physical modeling and some mathematical modeling indicates that your suit should be no more than half your astronaut's body weight. So, you know, for your typical human being, that's about 65 to 70 kilos. And that means no more than 35 kilograms max for an EVA suit. And that's an extremely demanding thing to design for. No EVA suit has come near that. No prototype, no operational one. The other one, Mars, over most of its surface, has too much air pressure, even low though it is, to allow sublimation cooling to work effectively. So you need a whole new approach of cooling to actually be able to move around and work on Mars, generating heat and so on. Some things you won't need on Mars. The temperatures are not as extreme as either in Earth orbit or on the lunar surface. You won't need a micrometeorite or space debris protective layer, and that will save some weight. So in the end, you will need very different suits for these different environments. And I should say the current suits are extremely dangerous. There were something like shoulder injuries are really common during EVA training in the neutral buoyancy lab. Some of these have required, something like 9% of astronauts who've trained in neutral buoyancy lab required surgical intervention because of shoulder injuries. We can't accept that on Mars. You know, there is going to be no significant surgery lab capable of handling that. On the moon, one astronaut, even though there are only 15 EVAs, one astronaut had his wrist cut to the bone by the locking ring of his glove. You know, that's not something we're going to separate. In fact, it's difficult to get the statistics, but it would appear that the accident rate, fortunately not the fatality rate, but the accident rate, the injury rate of EVA suits to date far exceeds what any industry, and I've worked in the mining industry, the commercial diving industry, none of these high-risk environments would accept an injury rate that we seem to take for granted on EVA. So we need a revolution in spacesuit design.
Oh, thank you so much, John, for all those really interesting insights. I certainly heard about delamination of fingernails and finger injuries, but I had no idea about the sheer volume of other serious injuries. And like you say, we're not going to have orthopedic surgical capacity on Mars. That just is not going to exist. And you raise a really interesting point about occupational medicine and how much risk, if you like, we're willing to tolerate of serious injury or accidents for astronaut expeditioners that we're not actually going to have the medical kit to fix. There's a lot of discussion going on at NASA at the moment about what type of medical kits we should take and using mathematical modelling to try to maximise content versus mass versus volume. etc. So these are all really important issues. Thank you so much for that great introduction for the question. Would anyone else like to comment on this one?
Thank you, John. I found it absolutely fascinating. One of the issues which seems bizarre was the case of the astronaut that just about drowned in his spacesuit. I shouldn't laugh, but because of a problem with the filtration system in the spacesuit. And one of my areas of research was diving physiology, and I looked at the thing called the diving response in humans. That is, when you do breath hold diving, you get a reaction that tends to conserve the limited supply of oxygen in your body. And but it amazed me that an astronaut could be at risk of drowning in his own spacesuit. Do you have any comment about that incident?
Yes. If you go, water behaves differently in zero gravity because it's not going to fall down or flow down, and so surface tension makes it do weird things. And there's lovely videos you find of YouTube of what happens when you ring a wet washer in zero gravity, and the water basically spreads everywhere. And this was this was the Italian astronaut. There was a leak in his water supply, and there had been other leaks as well, and it started spreading all over his face, and there's nothing he could have done about it. Fortunately, this will not be a problem on the Moon or Mars. It'll just flow downwards into their boots. Just hope that there's no electronics in there that'll get fried. Alan Shepard survived that in his first flight, so we just have to make sure the electronics are moisture-proof in the event of accidents. Some of the Apollo astronauts had a very sticky flight from a number of liquids. Sometimes the urine bag didn't connect properly, shall we say. Another case, they had orange juice in the later flights to try and solve the problem or manage the problem of potassium loss. And when that leaked, the people ended up with a very, very sticky spacesuit for several days. Fine for the Apollo, but for an EVA every other day on the Moon or Mars, that's not going to be a good thing. Cleanable spacesuits is also important.
Well, perhaps we might, in the interest of time, go on to our last teaser question, which is, what known unknowns do we need to prepare for regarding long-duration exploration missions? We've already talked about a few of the known unknowns, but perhaps there are others that you might like to add to the discussion.
Well, actually, I just have a kind of funny retort to that. That would be the known unknown that we don't prepare for is meeting with aliens, really. I mean, everything that relates to the physical environment, I think we have the technology, we are doing studies, we have still so many questions open up. Speaking as a geophysicist, I love the science because we, formulate hypotheses and collect data. And I think, we have a very good understanding of the environment on Mars, that at least that any potential humans might get in contact with. And now I'm not advocating that there are aliens on Mars, but if you think longer term missions and deep space missions, that would be the only unknown that I can think of at the moment that might, make us want to reconsider everything in terms of how prepared humans need to be, including on the side of psychologically prepared. But that was just also a little bit of a fun remark.
And this is where our currently popular word resilience comes in. You think of people like, say, Shackleton or Mawson in the Antarctic, who encountered totally unexpected circumstances, but they were resilient. And we've had to, this is very important currently in Australia. What lessons from 2 years where we've had massive bushfires and then floods and then a pandemic and now more floods. What makes it? Some people do well and some people not so well. And how can we select and train for that? Make sure who's going to do well under the unexpected, the unknown unknowns when they crop up, and who won't.
If I actually, John, you made me think about this right now when you mentioned the unexpected, which happened in recent years, as we know, the pandemics and the flood. But I wonder whether, yes, resilience is necessary, but people don't react the same way to the same kind of threat. So I may weather a pandemic in a different way than I may react to a flood or to a fire. So I think at the end of the day, yes, resilience, but I don't know that we can actually screen in terms of possible reactions that people may have, because I know personally, just as a sample of one, that is myself, my reaction to the news of the pandemic was very different than my reaction to the news of floods or fires. And so I would imagine that unless I am a unique case, that might be true of other humans as well. So how do we measure resilience when it's really calibrated depending on the individual based on the type of threat that they're gonna face?
Oh, I agree.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point. And when I was about 13, I lived through a tropical cyclone because my family was living in far north Queensland at the time, and we suffered extensive damage to our house, and a lot of the things that we owned were destroyed. So suddenly a lot of your life that you've known and the things that are precious to you are suddenly gone. And I agree with you that was sort of a totally different challenge to when we found out about the pandemic. And you will laugh at this, no doubt, but as a doctor with an interest in public health, at first I was kind of almost even excited. Oh, this is a once in 100-year event. How amazing is it to be going through this experience, like the Spanish flu 100 years ago. But the novelty soon wore off when the impact on everybody's lives. And I was watching the Johns Hopkins dashboard every day, and the number of people who are dying, and it sort of the enormity of it starts to hit you. And of course that starts to affect you in other ways, because you actually sort of feel so much empathy and sadness for the people who are getting really sick and dying and their families. And so I think that's a really valid point. Thank you.
But then I think, therefore, you mentioned something which is really useful, for this conversation at least, that when the pandemic struck, you approached it as a professional and thinking, okay, we're going to collect data, we're going to do this, we're going to do that, which is not dissimilar from when a geologist goes, for example, to a place where there has been an earthquake, thinking only about the strike and the dip of the faults and measuring all that. So maybe that aspect of resilience comes that could unify more or less all experience is being trained to look at things always objectively in terms of some phenomenon that we can then measure and evaluate. So think like a scientist all the time, essentially, and that might perhaps, alleviate that aspect of reacting differently to different scenarios. But if we are always prepared to consider every scenario from a professional viewpoint, from the perspective of collecting data, then that might bring us over the line of that general resilience aspect that John was talking about.
I think it'd be worth looking at that in addition to there being psychological stresses, there are also going to be psychological positives to being part of a lunar or a Martian expedition. And people who go into orbit or into space even for short periods of time, talk about the overlook or the overview effect and how important this is for them. We have people going down to the Antarctic time after expeditions, time after time again, even if all they're doing is being cooks or mechanics or whatever, there's something there that they find a positive experience. I can remember, working at very high altitude in Ladakh, 5,400 meters, and unless it was a lack of oxygen, it was just an amazing experience. Half the atmosphere is below me, and here I am looking at these glaciers and these rocks, and the same, when I landed in the Arctic. I'm in the Arctic. How amazing is this? And that sense persisted. It becomes normalized, but it's still there is a sense of privilege, of awe, of things that you can remember and take back, and even facing danger. I'm a volunteer firefighter, and during the black summer, nothing particularly exciting happened, but nonetheless there were experiences there in which life lessons I can learn, insights I've gained, which I can apply. I mean, these are situations that challenge people, are not always negative. They can be very positive as well.
Tim, would you like to comment on this topic?
Yeah, I mean, I guess one of the sort of really unknown unknowns that I touched on before was the response of circadian rhythm for humans that are not going to have sort of specific night and day, which, as we know, the vast majority, if not all our cells in our body are under some form of circadian rhythm control. We open our eyes in the morning and, there's a change in melatonin and cortisol, etc. And functions revolve around that. And obviously on the ISS and seeing multiple sunrises and sunsets per day, there are certain ways that circadian rhythm is tried to be controlled in terms of lighting. Feeding schedules are big things as well. But perhaps on these even further deep space missions, it's going to be unknown what will happen in that regard. And maybe on Mars, when there's a dusty atmosphere or a lack of blue light in the spectrum hitting the retina, then perhaps that may be a long-term adaptation that humans might need to make, or living underground in lava tubes and having no exposure to sunlight, how that affects biological rhythms, not only radiation exposure, which what I've been looking at, but in terms of everyday metabolism and that sort of thing. And even a little bit more futuristic is what may happen to that if astronauts ever get induced into states of torpor or artificial hibernation, is how to keep the circadian rhythm ticking over in someone in that position, and how to feed them through peg tubes and all that sort of thing, which is a little bit sort of out there at the moment, but potentially something that may be used in these long distance missions. So that's a really big unknown in that regard.
If we're talking about out there possibilities, what would be the consequences of a female astronaut falling pregnant when at the time of arrival on the surface of Mars? If the stay time on the surface is 17 months, she will have given birth to that child. That child will become the first Martian, and that child may have maybe 9 months or more of growing under 1/3 G. And that, I think, is a really interesting problem. If we look at what is the future for children born in a Mars colony, then the question is, what's the relationship between nature and nurture? I wonder if anybody would like to make any comments on that situation.
It's actually a topic I've been talking about quite a bit over the last 12 months or so, the whole issue of reproduction in space. And I've been increasingly interested in this whole issue of child development. And of course, we know that microgravity has a very severe effect on bone metabolism and on muscle strength. And for a child to go through the normal stages of growth and development, they actually need gravity to be able to work against. And are their bones and muscles going to develop normally if there's no gravity at all? Are they going to learn to roll over or stand up? You know, just those really basic things that we take for granted. And then, of course, there's the issue that if you grow up in a microgravity field, or if you grow up on Mars, what happens when you want to come back to somewhere like Earth, where, relatively speaking, there's a huge amount of gravity, so it would be hypergravity conditions for you, and is your body going to be able to manage with that? So there are a lot of incredibly complex issues, and even things like embryological development are very adversely affected in microgravity conditions. So I think there's still a lot to learn before we even contemplate pregnancy or childbirth or childbearing in space. And I think that just underlies the importance of trying to ensure that nobody does fall pregnant while they're on these very long missions. Of course, humans are humans, but we at the same time, we need to do our best to try to make sure that doesn't happen until we're ready for it. So I think what we might do is finish with putting you all on the spot to perhaps name one thing that you're most excited about in relation to space or space research at the moment, and what you'd like to find out more about over the next 12 months, whether it's your research or something that you're just genuinely curious about. So who shall I start with? I might start with Tim.
That's a tricky one. I think it's all very exciting. I think broadly speaking, the development of actually having an Australian space agency has been a very good start and exciting in terms of trying to get our capabilities together in terms of everyone's special fields and how they can work together to become a nation involved in space research, and also trying to encourage future space researchers in terms of STEM and that sort of thing, and driving forward the industry itself. So that would be a broad excitement for me, I guess, in that regard.
Yes, thank you. Good point. It's wonderful to have our own space agency. We of course would like it to be doing more and to become more prominent. John.
Well, there's so much happening now. It's not like it was 20 years ago when there was a big event coming up and you could sort of look forward to it. Whereas now it's just a continuous downpour of exciting results, exciting missions happening all the time from so many different countries. I will pick Mars because that's what I'm interested in, and it's fantastic having three very different robotic rover missions on the surface in three very different locations. Curiosity, Perseverance, and Zhurong, all doing fantastic work. So that's really exciting. I hope our team at Human Aerospace will be able to make significant challenges or advances towards solving the challenge of Mars EVA suits and associated suits in the next year or so. And I think the fact we have an Australian space agency still amazes me. I think there's a lot of work to be done to actually normalise this and expand its activities across a wider range of topics than at present. But yeah, that's still something that every time I think about it says, well, finally we've done it.
Yes, I understand there's a long history behind all of that. So, Graziella.
Yeah, well, I continue doing more or less what I was doing before the Australian Space Agency was founded, the main research I do is by being part of international space mission and science teams. That's the thing that really excites me quite a lot. exploring new world. I think the main focus at the moment in Australia seems to be particularly on low Earth orbit and Earth observation, which is great, and you know, it needs to be done. But I was always curious about the great beyond out there, and for the way that I do that I explore the universe outside of low Earth orbit is by being a member of international space missions. I hope that the presence of an Australian space agency in Australia will make it easier for other people as well who do not have the same connections, because I am Italian. At the end of the day, that's my country, goes to space and it's easy. But people who, you know, Australian born, Australian raised, to be doing space in Australia, participating in big international missions, I think that needs to be the next step up. And I look forward for that to happen. Maybe the Moon to Mars initiative is one way to get that started, but there is lots more happening out there. And I know that a lot of Australian scientists would be very well prepared to make a great impact and contribution in those missions as well. It's just a matter of making that possible.
Yes, very, very well said. Thank you. And Brett, we might give you the last word.
Thank you, Rowena. Well, I have been impressed by the knowledge base of Australian scientists in the medical area, and I think it would be important for the Australian Space Agency to seriously consider the possibility of establishing some kind of space medicine component to their objectives. I had the distinct impression that the Australian Space Agency was largely established to promote Australian businesses, and that worried me a lot. I was very excited about the establishment of the Australian Space Agency, but I had hoped that there would be more science, that it would support science more, and in particular, of course, from my aspect, space medicine. Because I think, and I hope Tim agrees with me, that we have people in Australia who can make a contribution. I'm trying to get a research project started at the University of Tasmania at the moment to look at some tests I'd like to develop for use on the International Space Station in relation to cardiovascular physiology. But it's not easy. And I think we need to make it clear to the Australian Space Agency that we are here, we have the knowledge base, and we are capable scientists, and we can contribute to Australia in the area of space medicine, space physiology, and space science. So not just the business component. So that's my thought at the moment.
Yes, and I totally agree with you. And I think we have to continue to advocate for that, because we have so many brilliant clinicians and scientists working here in Australia, and we can certainly punch above our weight. So it's up to us to keep kind of putting our hand up and saying, hey, we're here and we're capable and we want to be part of it. So, seeing no questions, I would like to say thank you so much to all of you for coming along today. I think it's been an absolutely brilliant panel discussion. I really enjoyed it and learned so much from each of you, and you've given us some brilliant contributions to think about. So on behalf of ASBX and all the people here today and the people watching later, a very, very sincere thank you. Now I'd like to invite our participants here to give our panelists a virtual round of applause. I'm sure you all know where the reactions button is. So, so thank you very much, everyone. I'll stop the recording there.